The sky was quiet in a way that only war can make it. A thin blue silence stretched over a world tearing itself apart. Inside a cramped cockpit, a pilot sat alone with the sound of his own breathing, knowing that one pull of the throttle would push him beyond the limits of human flight. In that moment, speed was not an achievement, it was a wager with death. A machine built for 7 minutes of power, fuel that could melt through flesh, a glide back to Earth if anything went wrong. Yet men climbed into these fragile shapes of metal and fire because the war demanded answers no one had found before. Answers measured not in victories, but in seconds. Across the front lines, other pilots faced their own impossible choices. Some needed speed to survive a single attack run. Others needed endurance to cross an entire continent and bring their crews home. Different machines, different philosophies, different kinds of courage. And somewhere between the roar of rocket engines and the steady hum of long-range escorts lies the question that defined an era of aerial combat. When every life depends on a machine, what does it truly mean for a fighter to be the king of speed? The war in the skies had reached a breaking point long before anyone realized it. By 1943, the balance of power over Europe was shifting in ways that terrified both strategists and pilots. The Allies were pushing deeper into German airspace with heavy bombers, while German fighter units were stretched thin, unable to intercept every formation that crossed their borders. Each new raid demanded a response faster, higher, and more desperate than the last. For Germany, the search for a miracle weapon did not begin with metal or fuel, but with a man who had spent his life studying gliders. Alexander Lippisch believed the future of aviation lay not in bigger engines or heavier weapons, but in reducing drag until nothing unnecessary remained. His tailless designs looked alien on the ground, almost delicate, but in the air they promised something extraordinary: the ability to move through the sky with minimal resistance. When war came, Germany needed that kind of thinking. The first prototypes of his radical aircraft were little more than experimental gliders. They carried no weapons, no armor, and barely enough structure to survive their test flights. Yet even in these early forms, pilots reported sensations unlike anything they had known. The aircraft wanted to leap upward. Its controls were hypersensitive. Every movement felt as if the machine were straining toward a future no one could fully understand. These tests laid the groundwork for what would become the Messerschmitt Me 163, the world's first operational rocket-powered fighter. But innovation carried a price. The engineers who attempted to turn these concepts into a weapon chose propulsion that pushed the boundaries of chemistry, hypergolic fuel mixtures that ignited the moment their components touched. The power they offered was immense. The risk was greater still. Ground crews handled the clear, almost innocent-looking liquids with protective suits, knowing a single spill could burn through skin, muscle, and bone. Pilots knew that once airborne, they were strapped to a tank full of lethal chemicals. Then, in 1941, the world caught a glimpse of what this dangerous new technology could do. A prototype Me 163, still rough around the edges and powered by an early Walter rocket motor, was towed into the sky above Peenemünde. When Heini Dittmar released from the tow plane and ignited the engine, the aircraft lunged forward with an acceleration no pilot had ever felt. Within moments, he was traveling faster than any propeller-driven fighter in existence, shattering the 1,000-kilometer-per-hour barrier. This was not merely a milestone, it was a revelation. Rocket propulsion could achieve speeds no conventional engine could match. On paper, it offered Germany a path to reclaiming control of its own skies. In practice, it raised a question that would define the next stage of aerial warfare. Could any pilot survive a machine designed to fly at the edge of physics? The moment Germany pushed the Me 163 into full-power flight, the boundary between innovation and catastrophe narrowed to the width of a rivet. On the 6th of July 1944, Heini Dittmar climbed toward the thin air above northern Germany in a machine that behaved less like an aircraft and more like a launched projectile. The rocket motor behind him thundered with a violence that shook the entire airframe, burning fuel so rapidly that every second mattered. Climbing nearly vertical, the Me 163 performed as no fighter ever had. It surged past 6,000 meters, then 10,000, then leveled off at 12,000, where the horizon curved subtly beneath him. When Dittmar pushed the throttle to its limit, the aircraft sliced through the air at over 700 miles per hour. At that speed, the sky stopped behaving like an ally. The rudder began to flutter, a deadly warning that the forces on the tail were reaching their breaking point. In a split second, Dittmar cut the engine. Silence replaced rocket thunder. He was now gliding a wounded aircraft, alone over a hostile landscape, with a failing vertical tail and only one chance to bring the machine back intact. His descent was a controlled fall through thin air, each adjustment a gamble against structural failure. When the skid finally scraped the concrete at Peenemünde, sparks trailing behind him, Dittmar had done more than set a record. He had shown how close the future of aviation was to tearing itself apart. But the Me-163's power came with brutal limitations. 7 minutes of flight was all it could offer. After 1 or 2 attack passes on Allied bomber formations, it became nothing more than a fast-moving glider, unable to maneuver, unable to escape. American pilots quickly adapted. They learned to wait above known Me-163 bases, watching for the bright plume of a rocket launch. Once the rocket motor burned out, the aircraft was defenseless. Many Me-163 pilots were shot down within sight of their own runways, gliding home with empty fuel tanks. Meanwhile, the air war over Europe was entering its most violent phase. American bomber crews facing catastrophic losses needed a fighter that could survive deep inside the Reich, not just sprint through it. The P-51 Mustang, once considered a flawed design, evolved into exactly what the Allies needed. When the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine replaced the Allison, everything changed. The Mustang found its strength at high altitude, where bomber formations traveled and where German fighters rose to meet them. In the skies above Germany, the Mustang reshaped the balance of power. It did not rely on explosive acceleration or exotic fuels. Its strength came from endurance, stability, and the ability to stay in the fight long enough to matter. When Mustang squadrons began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, German pilots could no longer retreat behind the safety of distance. The war's tempo changed. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could challenge the Luftwaffe deep in its own airspace. It was not the fastest machine of the war, but it was the one that met the moment. The turning point of the air war did not arrive with a single battle, but with a series of revelations written in smoke across the German sky. One of the clearest came on the 12th of October 1944, when a 1-year-old American pilot named Chuck Yeager escorted a formation of B-17 seconds toward targets near Bremen. Flying his P-51 Mustang, he watched as more than 20 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds maneuvered below him, German fighters preparing to tear into the bombers once the escorts turned away. But they never got the chance. Yeager's squadron rolled into a diving attack, catching the German formation unaware. What followed was a whirlwind of speed, skill, and survival instincts. Yeager became an ace in less than 15 minutes, downing 5 fighters in a single engagement. When his Mustang returned to base, its fuel tanks nearly empty, its guns spent, the aircraft bore no bullet holes. The message was unmistakable. The Mustang could fight, endure, and return home. Yet while the Americans were proving the value of range and reliability, Germany was unveiling the next leap in aviation. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, emerged from its runways like a glimpse of the future. Pilots described the acceleration as smooth and relentless, the cockpit quiet, the climb effortless. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, the jet could outrun anything the Allies flew. Its 4 30mm cannons could tear apart a bomber with a single burst. On paper, the Me-262 should have restored the Luftwaffe's dominance. In practice, time was against it. The Jumo 004 engines were fragile creations. Built from low-quality alloys Germany resorted to late in the war, many lasted only 10 to 20 hours before failing. Maintenance crews swapped engines constantly. Fuel shortages grew so severe that entire units of Me-262 seconds sat idle on their airfields, unable to launch even a single sortie, and when the jets did take off, they faced new dangers. American pilots learned to wait above their bases, diving onto the jets during takeoff or landing when their engines were slow to spool up. German aviators called the approach path the Valley of Death. The Me-163's fate was worse still. Its hypergolic fuels made it as deadly to its own pilots as to its enemies. Training accidents mounted. One pilot, Joseph Posse, died when a ruptured fuel line dissolved his body before rescue crews could reach him, a reminder that the cost of innovation was often paid in the most horrific ways. By early 1945, both revolutionary aircraft, the rocket fighter and the jet fighter, were crippled by shortages, rushed development, and strategic collapse. Germany had built machines that pushed the limits of physics, but not machines that could survive a war of attrition. Their speed was unmatched. Their impact was limited. When the Me-163 glided to a silent halt and the Me-262 sputtered on failing engines, the promise of revolutionary speed gave way to a harsher truth. No aircraft can change a war if it cannot stay in the sky. The transformation of the air war did not happen in a single mission or through a single aircraft design. It emerged from a shift in how the United States understood the relationship between technology, strategy, and survival. In the dark days of 1943, with bomber losses rising to levels no force could sustain, American commanders recognized that courage alone could not carry crews across Germany and back. They needed a fighter that could escort them every mile of the journey. The Mustang provided that answer, and with it came a new kind of pressure on the Luftwaffe. Once P-51 squadrons began flying deep penetration escort missions, the strategic landscape changed. German fighters could no longer strike and withdraw behind the safety of distance. Every attack carried the risk of facing seasoned American pilots over their own airfields and towns. The bomber loss rate fell from catastrophic to manageable within months. For crews who had once stepped into their aircraft expecting not to return, the difference was measured in lives saved rather than sorties flown. Across the world, other nations watched this shift with equal interest. Germany's Me-262 demonstrated that jet propulsion was no longer a theoretical concept, but the blueprint for the future. Its failures could not obscure its importance. When the war ended, Allied engineers combed through captured research, studying wing sweep angles, engine configurations, and aerodynamic data. Within a few years, the United States and the Soviet Union fielded jet fighters whose lineage traced directly back to German wartime experimentation. The F-86 Sabre and MiG-15, aircraft that would duel over Korea, owed part of their heritage to the Me-262's brief, turbulent career. Yet it was the Mustang that left the more human legacy. Its impact was not found in laboratory data or wind tunnel curves, but in testimony from the men who flew it. Pilots described it as honest, predictable, and forgiving when everything around them was chaos. It proved that in modern warfare, superiority was won not by extremes, but by balance, a machine that flew far enough, fought hard enough, and returned home often enough to matter. The world learned two parallel lessons from these competing designs. Speed could open doors to the future, but only reliability could shape the outcome of a war. And in the skies above Europe, where thousands of lives hinged on the performance of a single escort fighter, the Mustang became both a shield and a turning point. Its legacy endures not because it was perfect, but because it did what war demands. It gave time, space, and survival back to the people who needed them most. History often remembers the fastest machine, the one that shattered a barrier or set a record that seemed impossible at the time. But in war, the truth is rarely that simple. The Me-163 held the crown of absolute speed, slicing through the air at more than 700 miles per hour, a rocket-powered glimpse of what flight might become decades later. The Me-262 carried the torch of innovation, proving that jets would define the next era of air combat. Yet neither could change the course of the war that birthed them. Their brilliance burned too hot, too fast, held back by fragile engines, dangerous fuels, and a crumbling nation that no longer had the time or resources to let their potential unfold. The P-51 Mustang, slower on the stopwatch but unshakable in purpose, did what the others could not. It flew deep into enemy territory, held its own in a turning fight, and brought its pilots home again and again. It was never the most glamorous machine, but it understood something essential. A fighter is only as valuable as the missions it completes and the lives it saves. In the hands of men like Chuck Yeager, pilots who had faced death more than once, the Mustang became more than a machine. It became a promise. Decades later, when surviving pilots of World War II were asked which aircraft they would fly again if they had to return to combat, they did not choose the fastest or the most advanced. They chose the one that gave them a future. That answer, quiet and unadorned, is perhaps the clearest measure of what truly matters in war. Speed can break records. Innovation can shape decades. But reliability, the ability to endure, adapt, and survive, is what shapes history. So the question remains, if you were the one stepping into the cockpit in 1944, knowing the sky ahead could end everything, would you choose raw speed, groundbreaking technology, or the aircraft that stayed honest when everything around it fell apart? Let us know in the comments. And if these stories of courage, engineering, and sacrifice resonate with you, consider subscribing. There are many more chapters of history waiting to be rediscovered. One aircraft, one battlefield, one human decision at a time.